Great, thank you very much. So thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be hosting this session. It's something that's very close to my heart. So for those of you who are just coming in, this is an art panel on archiving in times of crisis. And I think, I mean, sadly, I don't think it could be better timed because we seem to be lurching from crisis to crisis right now. So I just want to kind of introduce myself and my work just to kind of set a context for this conversation. So my name is Padmini Murray. I founded an organization called Design Beku. At Design Beku, our kind of efforts are towards making design and technology more local, more ethical, and decolonizing design and tech. So through these means, we try and also look at archives. Some of my work is around what I have increasingly begun to call injustice at the interface, which is looking at, say, the internet itself as archive and what kind of violence or infrastructural or epistemic violence large kind of multinational data corporations like Google or Facebook wage upon users of the internet through things like search and violations of data privacy. So much of my work when it comes to archives is about thinking about the feminist archive and what it means as an epistemological or ontological site. Because overwhelmingly, Indian feminism is still passed through a very dominant caste lens, and that kind of injustice is replicated online as well. So that's so my work has been looking at non-dominant caste activism and especially through the lens of feminism. I was very keen to have the people that we've invited today because they speak to a range of crises. So I think, and I think they're all connected as well. So we're talking obviously about climate change and ecological justice. And because that obviously is one of the largest contributors to the crisis that we are in today. And obviously political crises, kind of the various threats to democracy that this country is encountering and all over the world as well. So I just wanted to kind of briefly touch upon some kind of ways in which I feel this panel might be slightly different from the others in the way that it thinks about the archive. This morning we had an absolutely fantastic panel discussion led by Ranjini and Faisal, which looked at a varied number of community archiving and indigenous archiving efforts, largely from Australia and from India. And what I think was brought up in both in the discussion and in the conversations itself, that there is obviously a great need to kind of ensure that ownership and protocols around ownership are given to communities, or communities themselves possess those ownership rights, and that they should legislate who enters the archive. And I think it's an interesting and tricky question because a community is not a homogeneous or monolithic entity. So this is also about how do we work with consensus? How do we work with intersectionality and consensus, which are difficult questions, I feel, and it's something that we also work on because we do some work on marginalized communities in the city, in the smart city. And so when you have a kind of technological field where there are various marginalized communities, then how do you reach consensus to reconcile those intersectionalities? And I think that is a important and kind of necessary conversation that we need to keep having. I think another important point that was brought up this morning was the idea of the slow archive. So and this is very much in keeping with our philosophy at Design Beku, which is, again, embedding ourselves in a community, working sustainably with the community. I think it's very much a reaction against the designer or design thinking led philosophy of just kind of helicoptering in to a community, coming up with a solution and then leaving. And I think, I think all of the people who spoke this morning spoke to the fact that they have been working with the communities for years, that they have established great trust between the communities and themselves. And of course, these are all incredibly necessary and possible through slow archiving. But I think what the moment of crisis precipitates is the fact that we have to archive fast. One of the reasons that we have to archive fast is exactly for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, due to the kind of violence of things like search engines. So, many journalists, for example, complain about this all the time, that they may have written a story or report a few years ago that can no longer be found. And I think increasingly reasons for things disappearing from the internet are malicious. And I think we are all aware of the reasons why that is. I think it was very interesting that in the last week, with all the protests around Black Lives Matter and the whole conversation around taking statues down, as if statues were the only kind of reminder of history, and the archive was nothing at all. And I found that really interesting that people kept protesting the removal of statues when the internet exists. So if you want to find out about slavery, there are so many ways to find out about slavery. However, a lot of those ways are also under threat, which is why we need to also archive fast. And as a consequence, when we archive fast, there are different considerations, or maybe considerations that have to be taken under slightly different circumstances than when we are building the archive in a slow and sustained fashion. One of them is who goes into that archive, and I'm hoping Francesca maybe will speak a little bit to this. I think many of us who have been in a very amateur, scattered way tried to archive protests all over the country have come up against questions of who is in that archive, like who is visible in that archive, and the problems that that creates. So obviously we know that kind of surveillance and policing is now resorting increasingly to facial recognition, which immediately puts people in footage of protests at threat. This is obviously not at all particular to India. I think Hong Kong protesters before us, there was very kind of sustainably engaged with this danger. But it is something that is definitely of concern. Another kind of way in which kind of researchers and activists are trying to push against the kind of hegemonic national narrative is to also kind of build databases. And again, the Polis project, and Francesca will definitely talk a little bit about their work doing that. But it's also, again, who decides who is in that database? I think in the last week, there's been an amplification of violence against Dalit people. And again, the conversation about, should we have a database detailing kind of crimes against Dalits? And in a way, and I myself, I was part of a project called Halt the Hate that Amnesty did. We built a database of hate crimes against minorities. But again, in a way that actually might be a violent act in and of itself, because this violence is structural. None of this, an isolated numbers is not enough to, be a comprehensive archive of how that violence actually is enacted day on day, year on year. So again, these questions of who decides, how we archive, what are the knowledge systems that inform what we archive as well. So some speakers in the morning were speaking to the fact that they work with non-English archives, and a lot of us, especially working in the archives space, know that metadata and ontology schemas are built around English metadata terms, very Western kind of Enlightenment ideas of what ontologies are. And those are obviously not necessarily enough to encompass the kind of knowledge that we are archiving in the global south. So, so I would say that these are some of the kind of major issues that we tend to encounter in the crisis mode, which are slightly different from those who are working in a more kind of sustained fashion. So we are hoping that today we can have a kind of rich conversation about both kind of work that is being done in this space, but also how to go about work in this space. Because I think one wonderful thing is that I think people are increasingly aware of the importance of the archive and building their own archives. But it also isn't easy, especially due to the platforms that we are forced to use. So, for example, sharing content on a platform like Twitter immediately removes the metadata from the content. And so if we are trying to catalog recordings of protests, for example, that information is all lost. So, so how do we work with different platforms? How do we use different tools? I think these are all questions that hopefully all of us are interested in. And we can maybe talk to those further as the discussion goes forward. So I would like to call upon Francesca as our first speaker. Hey, Francesca.
Hello.
Yes, so, so Francesca is an independent researcher and journalist. She is one of the founders of the Polis project, and her work is grounded in the interdisciplinarity of urban, visual, and cultural studies. I'll let her talk about the Polis project and her work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you've thrown at me quite a few things to answer, and it's going to be quite challenging, but I'll try. Quickly, a few words of introduction about the Polis project. We are a collective, an interdisciplinary collective, and our main focus is on reportage, research, and resistance. We work along and around communities in resistance around the world, and much of our work is to try and give space to those voices that are not necessarily represented in the mainstream. Much of our work is also around the archive, and what Padmini just said about archiving fast is something that resonates very immediately with the kind of efforts that we are trying to make. One of our projects that is taking a lot of emotional and intellectual energy is what we call Watch the State. We started in December last year, and we were sort of pushed by a group of protesting students who basically needed help. They were directly involved in the protests after the CIA, and they were witnessing and being subjected to great police violence. So they reached out and say, how can we document what is happening? And so for the very nature of our collective, we sort of responded and set up an anonymous group of researchers who are stunning. I mean, it's a pity that we can't reveal their name for their safety, but I want to acknowledge their incredible work. And we've started logging instances of police violence against protesters. And that brought us to a wider thinking, which is, how do we think of the present and document the present, where when all the agencies and the branches of the state are complicit in proposing, enforcing, and perpetuating a system of oppression? What happens when the government, instead of protecting its people, is the very instrument of brutality? What happens when the police is the arm that enforces that brutality? What happens as citizens to where does the right to transparency and the right to understand how the state operates come into play? And obviously, this is a gigantic concern, and things happen so fast because we started documenting the protests themselves, but also the responses to the protest. And then history is always faster than us, even though we don't seem to acknowledge that. And then February comes, and then in Delhi, in North Delhi, there is this pogrom against minorities. And so Watch the State inevitably evolved into a platform that started looking at documenting instances of violence against minorities. And then not even a month passes, and the pandemic becomes a global emergency. And in India, the general lockdown is announced within 4 hours. And so, and is enforced with a violence and a brutality that is hardly imaginable. So again, you know, the team felt the need to respond and take that into account. So what we're basically doing is chasing what is happening and trying to be and trying to gather as much evidence as possible around every single instance in which we are witnessing state-sanctioned violence. And then it comes to one of your provocations, and I mean, this is fast. This is fast, and it's painful. So it's an incredibly demanding job, because we all want to do justice to the individual people who have been targeted by state violence, and that is also becomes, you know, for us as researchers, almost a way to take on the pain of the individual people who have been targeted, and it's a call to work to preserve their dignity, because that is also a very important question. Yeah, when news reporting around instances of state violence are often very gory and very sensationalistic. For us, the challenge was to remain truthful to the evidence of violence while respecting the dignity of people who have been the victims of such violence. So in terms of an archiving practice, is very complicated, because, you know, you need to still gather data, you need to gather evidence, but you need to remember that this is not things, but it's people and it's families, and there are, you know, communities around those people. And so for us, maintaining that kind of humanity and humane gaze and approach was fundamental, and went strictly along the data collection. The other thing that I think it's very important for us, and then, I mean, I'll leave it here, because that will, I mean, I'll be happy to take question at whatever point, is that, you know, we're witnessing an immense amount of violence. We're witnessing police brutality. We're witnessing abuses of power. We're witnessing unlawful detentions, instances of torture, the inaction of the judiciary, the complicity of the legislative power. So it's an incredibly complex situation that needs to be pieced together in a way that is meaningful, and that also is not ideological. Because I think that is the greatest challenge, because we all feel very strongly about what is happening, but then finding the balance between, you know, being taken over by your emotions, if you like, and your rage, which is, you know, also legitimate, and giving full voice to the data that we're collecting, is a very challenging act of juggling, because, you know, we need to be very rigorous, and we need also to let our rage as citizens fully expressed. So in that, you know, it's an interesting challenge also methodologically. How do you deal with all that? In the last thing that is, you know, I'm happy to discuss later, is the fact that when you document the present, there is always a great sense of urgency, and there is a very complicated balance to find between what is hearsay and what is true, and the possibilities of verifying the truth and the accuracy of certain information, especially when the information is so traumatic, is very complicated. And so that's, again, something I need to give full credit to our researchers, because, yeah, they've done an amazing job in trying, in spite of running and chasing, verifying each instance to be sure that we wouldn't produce fake news, that we wouldn't produce fake data that then would become false statistics, that we wouldn't, and again, that we would respect the dignity of each single individual who was the unwilling protagonist of instances of violence. Because, misrepresenting data in this particular case means to do a great injustice to individuals who have been suffering a great deal. So I think I'll leave it here for now, and then I'll be happy to take questions at whatever point.
Great. Thank you so much, Francesca. And that rather wonderfully kind of ushers in Tarunima because of exactly what you said about false and fake news, misinformation, and trying to kind of retain or ensure that one is being accurate in representing what's going on. Tarunima founded an organization called Tattle, and Tattle is a kind of an open source project that archives social media and chat content in order to make it more searchable and to aggregate it in, basically for it to be used for by fact-checking organizations to verify content. And I definitely, one reason why I wanted Tarunima here is that it is a crisis. Again, information and knowledge, we are definitely in a kind of informational crisis. And I felt that Tarunima's amazing work with Denny George at Tattle would be also interesting to most people to kind of understand how to handle that volume. Because again, I think for those of us whose archive is the internet, that's the volume and scale is a huge challenge. So how to work with those. So I will let Tarunima take it away. Thanks, Tarunima.
Okay. Am I audible now? Yeah. Okay. Hi. So thank you, Padmini, for inviting me to this panel, and thank you to the Milli team for putting together this event. It's really sort of humbling to speak in the event series with so many stellar panelists, and also in particular on this panel. I have to say that, I've stumbled into the world of archives, so I very much think of myself as a student here to learn from all of you as well. So with that, I'm just going to start talking about what Tattle is. And so, Padmini, you've given a good introduction. So we started working on Tattle in 2018, and at the time, it wasn't really called anything. We were just motivated by a sense of urgency and a need to respond to the misinformation we were seeing then. And so in early 2019, when the project was becoming better formulated, we articulated the goal as reducing the life cycle of misinformation on WhatsApp and chat apps in particular in context of India, and enabling open research on misinformation on these platforms, particularly because they're private and encrypted networks. I'm going to come back to this distinction of whether they're really private or not. So we set these goals in response to a sense of helplessness that, I think, as Padmini said, we often feel in that sense of crisis. But I think when I was thinking about this panel, it sort of did give me an opportunity to pause and the time to re-articulate and perhaps articulate differently, the exact crisis that Tattle is responding to. I think misinformation is a phenomenon. It's a qualifier for certain kinds of information, but it's not the crisis per se. And there's obviously, like, in some ways, like a lack of trust in traditional media institutions. That's a big part of the problem. But that this lack of trust should be foregrounded against the promise of spaces of democratic expression that new media technologies had presented to us in 2010, 2012. And not too far back, we actually embraced a lot of these digital spaces with limited or no moderation, where every person had a voice. So to pick out a line from a recent paper by Britt Paris and John Donovan, the new media technologies did not change how evidence works, right? But they provided new opportunities for negotiating expertise. And those opportunities were seized by people of a lot of different motivations. And some of those motivations are commendable and some of them are not. I think what we hadn't anticipated with these digital spaces was an inability of sort of our long set-in cognitive processes to become ineffective at responding to the speed and the volume of information on these platforms. And that is the crisis that Tattle is specifically responding to. There is the other unanticipated outcome, which is of calculated coordination of individual voices to create specific narratives. And that is definitely a second very important crisis. But that's a crisis that, let's say, Tattle trying to deal with the meta problem of misinformation rather than mis and disinformation in a specific context. We took a strategic choice to not work on that, the second one, or at least to not directly work on it. So with that roundabout introduction, I'm finally going to come down to what Tattle is doing. And so, as Padmini rightly said, we're collecting content from chat apps and apps in regional Indian languages. And so it's not all content, but it is content that is viral or can go viral. And we're making it searchable in Indian languages and in modalities in which the content is shared on these platforms. So what this enables people to do is to learn more context about a specific message they see on chat apps. So this context could be simple information such as the duration for which a particular message has been circulating, or just the different text messages that have accompanied the same video in the past. So just the different contexts in which a particular video might have been shared. It can also have context such as whether it's been verified by certain journalists or fact-checking groups or not. And at one level, this is intended as an intervention to let people verify or learn more about the context that they receive. But at another level, it is also an intervention to record and document very consequential conversations of our times. And these are conversations that proliferate in spaces such as WhatsApp groups that can't be neatly slotted into a binary of public or private, but the outcomes are undoubtedly, they undoubtedly play out in the public. And so that in itself introduces some really interesting and tough questions about like the ethics of archiving content from some of these groups. But one thing that, so one of the second goals for Tattle being that is to enable research and sort of transparent research. It is in some ways also a very limited way of enabling that without letting, let's say, governments and platforms have a peek into almost every conversation that we have online. So it's a tightrope balance is what I'd say. So it is in this effort of recording and documenting that, Tattle has stumbled into the world of archives. But we're forever floating between these different ontological positions of being a searchable database, a data commons, and an archive. And this is in part because of the way we framed this project with an explicit intent to intervene to a current problem, which perhaps, sort of the traditional archival projects have not, it's a burden that they have not borne, and for very good reasons. But this is also in part because of the kinds of content that we attempt to record. So as per a very recent qualitative study of content that is circulated on messaging apps in India, Pakistan, and Nigeria, only a third of the content that was circulated on these platforms was linked to a mainstream media website or a social media page. So most of this information contains most of the information that's shared on WhatsApp. And this is in the limits that people can do research on these platforms. So with that confidence, people have, this research said that most of it is anonymous rumors that do not contain links to an external source. And instead of thinking that, I think one of the things perhaps to also recognize is that people perhaps share reason because it's anonymous, not besides, not because it is not anonymous. In some ways, the anonymity is a reason for people to share that content. And so when you're archiving things from, that's true for any social media, but especially true for chat apps, we're capturing the content in transit with no easy method to trace back its journey to the source. And a phone number is the only identifier of a person sharing a message. And that can be used to track and harass an individual in a way that a Twitter ID or a blog link cannot. And so the safe sort of decision for us was to not collect any information on the user sharing this content. So what that lands up meaning is that, I mean, there is important information that you can collect, that perhaps people who are trying to sort of break disinformation networks and really trying to sort of track sources of certain information will find useful. But for a lot of reasons, and partly also to do with the volume of the content, it isn't safe for a lot of people for us to collect that content. Now the second thing that you mentioned was like the speed of the internet, but also like the volume, right? And so the volume of the content implies that we are unable to manually appraise every post and assess whether it is potentially going to be viral and relevant, and therefore, like, should we be saving it, as all archivists would hope, for posterity. But on social media, as in the Library of Babel, for every rational line or forthright statement, there are leagues of like cacophony and nonsense and incoherency, and without like some mechanism to reduce that, people will drown in good morning messages and selfies, right? Anyone who comes to this database or archive will drown in good morning messages and selfies. And so we can't sort of avoid the task of purging at least some of the content, and it's possible with some automation. But at this stage, I think we haven't even figured out what's the right way to define the problem. Are we appraising content for an archive, or are we filtering content for a database, right? Are we sort of selecting content, or are we like deleting content? So I think both the way you frame that question, it changes everything about how you approach the data sort of appraisal process. So I think, Padmini, as you said, that we are in a situation that I think all of us are at least have some imperative to archive really quickly, because it is in interest of a lot of individuals who benefit from virality of content for it to be transient, for it to be invisible. And so there is an imperative to archive really quickly. Having said that, one of the goals for Tattle is that when all of this content hits the archive, people should take the time, or people should somehow slow down in how they actually sort of consume information. And so in some ways, we do think of this, and where I think this is more closely an archival project is where people actually come to a particular post and really think of it like as not something that of just in that one post of itself, but like in a series of things, right? Like it has a genealogy, it has a journey, and it has, it's in context of other posts that have been put in the past. And so in some ways it is trying to really slow down how people think about certain content. So yeah, I think with that, I am going to pause and take questions afterwards.
Great, thank you so much, Tarunima. And I think that was, I mean, given that I have some idea of what you do, I think it was a very comprehensive overview of what you do in not that much time. And I think, what you say is so interesting about, knowing what to archive, right? Because there's also this idea of, that we have infinite space. But say, for example, the Library of Congress at one point had said that they would archive all of Twitter, but now they really can't, right? And I think for archivists across, both archivists working with historical content, but definitely for those of us working with digital content, this is a very difficult problem. What do we keep? What do we, how do we know what the significance of that content is? When will we know that significance in order to keep it? And so I think these are really, really tricky questions that we're still kind of struggling with. I think maybe something that we can touch upon a little later in the Q&A is also about like working across languages and kind of the challenges that poses, because I think so much of our content, obviously in India, is in different Indian languages, and obviously no size, one size does not fit all. I don't know what that is. Some strange of some railway intervention. Can people hear that? It was a train horn, I think, but yeah. Okay, right. Now we'll go on to Rahul Chopra. So Rahul is a coordinator of TROP which is a global climate change education project of the International Science council that aims to integrate climate change education in the curriculum across the world. He's also the coordinator and convener of the National Research Center of Climate Change at the Indian Institute of Science Education in Pune. And I think one reason why it's so great to get Rahul here is that obviously, as I said earlier, so many of our current concerns are predicated by climate change and the climate crisis. But also he's been doing, and his institution has been doing some invaluable work around mapping the COVID pandemic. And and he's going to speak specifically to how geomapping can contribute and also, in and of itself creates an archive, and how we can kind of glean information and make decisions based on that content. So, and this is something that I, hopefully when we're opening up the conversation, I'm interested in talking about, which is that how do we activate the archive? It's all very well to build an archive, but especially for those of us who are archiving the contemporary, how do we activate it? How do we animate it? How can it be actually used in the future? So, so Rahul's work, I think, speaks really well to that. So Rahul, please go for it.
Okay, so can everyone see me and see the screen and hear me? Yes, so thanks Padmini for having me on the panel, and big thank you to Milli Network. I think this Archives Week has been absolutely stunning, and it's just been fantastic to sit through this in this particular week. So today, briefly, what I'd like to do is just sort of walk you through a couple of projects that we've been involved with and addressing the crises of climate change, environmental change in India, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic in India itself. Just before I get into this, I just like to frame this in the larger context, which Padmini has already done, and I think has also been mentioned before, which is that often there is a need to create these resources in the midst of crisis. So whether it is climate change or it is the pandemic, when we assemble these tools, these repositories from which we draw solutions, and that's very important, is often the case of building the ship while you're already sailing, right? So in the case of education itself, we all know that curricular reform can be fairly slow. Sometimes it can't be influenced by real-time need. So the first project will talk about how we are addressing that particular issue. Similarly, for at least the pandemic in India, there have been several communities, experts and individuals who've come together, and they have essentially tried to create what is a real-time living archive, which is tracking this disease as it is moving around in Indian cities, right? So some of the work that we've been doing, how does this contribute to the efforts essentially? So I'll start with the climate education project, and Padmini mentioned it's called TROP. There's a story behind that, maybe for later, not so funny. But in any case, for this particular audience, I think one doesn't really need to say it, but we all know that climate change is probably one of the most significant issues of our times. And this is one which will affect the sustainable, equitable development of all countries and all citizens. And I'm saying that, with carefully thought out words. So if we have to come to solutions, which is something which we are very interested in addressing, what do we need to do? So the first thing that we think is important is that the population itself has to become aware of this issue. I'm not saying become experts, become aware. And this particular project seeks to increase climate awareness. How does it do it? It does it through education and educators. And in here, I'd like to stress that we are doing it through the formal education system. I'll talk later on in the chat if needed about why we are doing it in this fashion. So what we've done is we've collated, curated, and developed several educational resources. And these educational resources are both what we call teaching tools and lesson plans, which have a lot of detail built into them. And where we are different is that we are aiming to bring climate change awareness and education into the mainstream education system. So if we, just move with the assumption that everybody thinks climate change is a very important topic, and yes, it should be taught in, high school and in undergrad, colleges, and so on and so forth. But, when we went and looked at curriculum and syllabi from across the world, what we found was that climate change is offered in a rather meaningless way. And there are very, very few people who get to even learn about this, right? So if at all, if it is offered at all, then it would be offered in an earth sciences major or a geography major, and that too as, you know, one half of a course or so. And one can just go and look at the model curriculum of UGC of India as an example, and you'd see this. Now, this is not restricted to developing countries or underdeveloped countries or so. There are many, many parts in Europe as well that we've seen where there is a lack of this particular education. So much so that kids are on the street protesting, asking for curriculum to be introduced in their schools and colleges. Teachers are out on the streets, and these are from European, Australian examples too. So what we decided to do was say, let's not focus on climate change education as its own thing, because very few people will be able to gain something out of it. Rather, can we bring it to the core of all curriculum? What does that mean? It means, can some topics in many, many disciplines be taught using a climate-related example, right? So in that particular case, the syllabi, which is very restrictive for many, many educators, and educators are extremely strained for time, do not have to deviate from their prescribed syllabus. The examples that they use to teach topics in their discipline can be from climate change and climate science. So in the course of doing this particular style of teaching, your students automatically learn about climate change and climate science, right? So whether it is looking at, poetry through climate poetry, or it is looking at, how to read a text, but use a climate reading as the central part of it, whether it is to teach introductory calculus, but use climate-related data sets, and so on and so forth, right? So what we have are approximately 300 absolutely free educational resources on our website. And these are for teachers so that they can integrate this education with their curriculum. What are the disciplines? We have about 10 disciplines here so far. And these educational resources have been reviewed by more than 50 climate experts and 650 educators themselves from 10 different countries. This I just wanted to bring to your notice because it also speaks to, the metadata with which each sort of educational resource is actually mapped out. So, we have about 10 disciplines here. All the sciences are covered. Economics is there, social sciences, humanities, geography as well. Additionally, they are mapped to every climate theme. So if somebody wants to come from the climate science story, they can also do so. Very critically, what we did was we made sure that these are digital teaching tools and they are of different types. So the era of me or you or any teacher sitting and lecturing is probably done with the way it used to be, right? We cannot hold people's attentions. We found out that 8 minutes is the average attention span of a student in a classroom. So how do you actually have effective teaching in order to increase their awareness? Can we have a lot more hands-on activities which a student can do? In the post-COVID world, as well as in the current COVID world, right? There is a big need to move towards blended learning, the flipped classroom style of teaching. And so all of these can be addressed through using tools which include computer-based classroom lab activities, model simulators, video lectures, micro lectures, which are very, very popular with teachers already. And if you're bold enough, even games. Our teaching tools are from different languages. Some we have managed to translate into multiple languages ourselves. And they are from locations because we know that learning is most effective when it is location specific, right? This is a global project and we have been very fortunate to have a number of partners so we can disseminate this. And these include science unions, about 17 of them. There are about 6 national science academies of different countries and UN organizations who have also become partners, including the very, very strong World Climate Research Program and UNCC Learn and the World Met Organization. I won't go into details about this, but just say that each resource on the website of TROP ICSU actually undergoes 3 stages of review. And this is where we might be different from a number of digital repositories of educational material. Certainly the internal review, the review by climate experts for scientific accuracy, considering in some parts of the world this is still debated, I don't know why. And then finally, all this is very good, but if the people using it don't like it, it's pointless. So we need to go and get it reviewed by educators themselves to say, was this easy to use in your classroom? Because every classroom is not the same and every student is not the same. And therefore it must speak to all of who we want to finally reach out to. So in order to do so, we went and conducted workshops in 4 different continents, 10 countries, and about 650 teachers we could speak with. And the goal of that was to first get to understand whether these resources would actually work in their classroom for their kids, first and foremost, given all the issues which I'm sure will show up in terms of internet connectivity, bandwidth, access to computing, so on and so forth. What I've mentioned here for the teachers certainly, and by the teachers is where we are hoping to go to. And what we've done is, in the course of these workshops, we get the educators to try to create these materials and resources themselves, which we then bring to completion and post on the website, right? So then we can have an accurate representation from all parts of the world itself. Okay, so that's very briefly talking about the education project. I'll just sort of move on to, another crisis. Again, the scales are different in terms of, I think climate change needs to be addressed immediately, but the scale of that tends to be a little slower. And then this is another, project that we've been doing, which is mapping of environmental change in India and documenting and assessing how much environmental change is going on. And what I'll do is very quickly show you some of these snapshots of the types of, work that we are doing in order to understand issues such as, natural and artificial disasters. Here's a fire at a landfill in Bombay, but more critically draw your attention to the fact that how much of the smoke has spread across the city and the correlation with asthma cases in the immediate future of that. Whether you want to look and see and document how much environmental change has taken place in terms of deforestation. You can look at, Jabalpur across 30 years and see how much of the green cover has been lost, or you can see how much of a city has basically been, has grown over time. In the case of Bangalore, of course, everybody talks about it as the city of disappearing lakes now, very obviously sort of shown out here in these particular images on the top part or so. Now, these are not just pretty pictures that we're making for, just to impress people. The idea of this is to actually sit and quantify the change which is taking place almost at a yearly scale and spreading over at least 30 to 40 years, right? And that is data which is going to be very valuable to other people. What we want to do is also to say, can the environmental history of a region be extended through the use of old, historic, and antique maps? And here is an example of the work that we've done, where we've taken or gotten a map of Bangalore from 1914, essentially geo-referenced it and overlaid it on today's Bangalore, right? And you can, at a very, very high resolution, start to look and see how much change has taken place in individual neighborhoods over this time. And very interesting sort of things come out. So this is something which we are wanting to push for in a bigger way, to say, can the environmental history of India be extended through the use of historic and antique maps? Can these maps start to be used as primary sources for multiple sort of disciplines? And this is something which we would really hope to. Then just very, very briefly, this is a very small effort on our part of trying to contribute to understanding what is going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, these things are occurring at a wide variety of spatial and temporal scales. There are fantastic resources which already exist. There's large-scale collaboration, unlike anything that we've seen thus far. And at a national level, whether it is the coming together of under the umbrella of the Indian scientist response to COVID-19 group, which includes multiple disciplines and experts, or it is at individual levels, or it is crowdsourced from your COVID19India.org repositories or so. What we are trying to do is to understand this and say, can we understand a little more about the dynamics of the spread, and very importantly, the prevention and what we could do of this particular disease at a neighborhood level, at a Prabhag level within a particular city. Now, this data is available actually, and some of this is put out by the authorities themselves. And so we have these tweets which come out from Pune Smart City Control Center for the pandemic, and it tells you the patients according to wards or so, and even up to Prabhag level. Right? There are multiple things that we have done with this, which is try to first map out the containment zones and to actually try to see how the containment zones have evolved over time. It kind of tells you whether the containment strategy itself has been, very successful or not successful, or are containment zones itself spreading, or are cases getting much more pronounced within a containment zone. Many of these things are actually, fairly commonsensical, but we wanted to actually test it out as well. Are there a greater number of cases in areas where there is low income housing? And, you kind of see that in this particular case. Where are the hospitals according to Prabhag and according to wards where patients can potentially be taken and get good care, right? Where can potential new care centers, which could be schools and hotels, and be set up in Prabhags, in wards, should there be a great rise in the number of cases in the time to come within that particular individual Prabhag or ward, right? So these are sort of ways in which what we can actually help in the preparedness to essentially try to address this particular pandemic. So I'll stop here because I think, very briefly just mention these projects. But just as a final sort of parting line, which is saying that the tools themselves, right, for all of these crises didn't really exist as givens. And it is the crises themselves that have forged the archives. And these are what is needed to address, say, living history in the making itself. So I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions beyond this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rahul. And I think your work kind of particularly draws attention to the fact that I think when we've been talking about archives, I think there is an emphasis on kind of the written and kind of the two-dimensional, and the fact that, archiving work also has to be, off maps of, 3 dimensions across space, is something that is kind of very valuable because it intersects with other forms of archival objects. In a way that just kind of sheds kind of extra and interesting light on them. So I think, this is a lovely moment to bring in Sangeeta Dharmarajan, who is a young researcher, if I can say that, who interned at NCPS and is starting her own COVID archive. And I think, we are seeing a number of efforts to archive this particular historical moment, because obviously it is unprecedented times, as we keep hearing, the new normal. And so I think Sangeeta might have really interesting things to say as to, how to start off, with a project like this. What are the challenges? What is it that they have gained from doing this project? So yeah, so Sangeeta, if you want to share your screen and the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Padmini. And firstly, I just want to thank Venkat, Hari, and the Milli team for giving us this space to discuss our attempt at archiving. So Corona Caches is essentially, so we are called Corona Caches, and we are a digital contemporary collecting archive, and we aim at collecting experiences and memories one associates with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have kept a target audience, but not limited to certainly to the student and the broader education community. And we largely defined it considering the reach that we have as students ourselves, and try building on other audiences through this. So we consider the student community as important because of how quick we respond to social and political trends, and that would be useful to capture this knowledge to get a different dimension of understanding this crisis. So we drew inspiration from many efforts happening currently, and to name a couple of them, there's the Journal of the Plague Year, inspired, taking its name from Daniel Defoe's novel. Then there's Corona in the City by the Amsterdam Museum, 6 Feet Photography, and a couple of other oral history projects as well. So, but I mean, these are some of the amazing projects that are happening currently to document this crisis. And although not to put it on a comparison scale, we are restricted in many fronts and have this obvious limitation of it being begun by students, but I feel it's an attempt we made nonetheless. So when we began the project, we let ourselves be guided to shape the archive to serve as an imaginative space where you let each individual's experience weave around different objects, spaces, and also people to bring about effective encounters, to expand ideas, and to also develop a sense of collective remembrance, to have each individual's experience become a shared experience in this process. So, as part of the project, we also undertook an undertaking a couple of oral history interviews where our initial attempts have been focused on the broad issues of identity with regard to geographic divides and gender dimensions. So, we are in the process of collecting experiences of students from the Northeast who were and are subject to racist attacks from the beginning of COVID-19 to more disturbing testimonials that happened during the lockdown. On the other hand, we're also collecting interviews of students who belong to the Cure community spectrum. So we feel that they are in a very uniquely isolated position now. So, one, they are cut off from physical spaces that affirm their identity, and at the same time, they're also located within homes that are hostile to their gender identity. So, the hope is to go beyond acknowledgement and try to include them in the archiving process. So I think we had sessions on how it's about evidence and truth. So we aim to capture such paradoxes, this urgency or anxiety to capture, this diversity of experiences that come out of this pandemic. For many of us, we live in comforts of home. I mean, for those of us who are privileged enough, and at the same time, you live with a very fear of gripping the virus. It's not also just these interesting dichotomies that we aim to capture, but also these everyday ordinaries and accustoms to new routines and new normal, wearing masks and an emphasis on hygiene and so on. So I mean, to just share the project, I'll just share my screen. um, all right, just a second. So this is the archive, and so these are a couple of submissions that we've been receiving. So each submission in itself deal with paradoxes and also, different submissions viewed apart also try and deal with the sort of interesting dichotomies of, living with contrasting experiences. So there are more. So we've given a loose division of people, places, and possessions, but this is not a stringent division that we have given so far. Um, so you have essays, we've received poems, we've also received videos that we've posted on our social media handles. So there's a lot of sort of submissions that we've been dealing that has sort of so many that talks about diversity. So we let our project to be guided by the twin principles of having a diverse as well as an inclusive space. And to further it, I think I just would like to end by making a case, whether or not it's a time of crisis, it's but documenting student life in campuses can yield us a mine of materials. It can be from the side of an institution or an institution guided response, or also in informal circles among students acting in their own way. So you allow us, or allow students to develop a wholesome narrative of an institution. I think the one of the main challenges that I see as we were, as we were working on the archive is, student experiences can be a little difficult to, capture. It's because of this constant turnover in terms of, frequent founding and dissolving of student organizations, or the kind of student bodies that change every year, and so on. So to talk about a process to go about it, it's about, first, it's very critical to change the way students perceive the archives. So there's a stereotypical view of, seeing archives as a repository of old newspapers and journals. So how do you change students' lack of understanding about the archive and its role in the university is perhaps one of the most important issues that we first have to deal with. And second, keeping into consideration is central to the question of what to archive, and also how has the role of technology played in institutions in record keeping practices, and what types of records, and also what kind of materials do you want to collect to your archives to keep it beyond just records. And I think perhaps the most important question that the project deals with, and in the broader sense of trying to document student life, is to understand what motivates, or what would motivate a student or a student organization to transfer materials to an archive. And how do you best convey to students that their culture and the kind of experiences is very integral to a particular institution, or in terms of understanding a crisis. So most often students don't know that their records are more are important beyond their own use, and also you have a further integral part in understanding how a university's historical tapestry that kind of elicits research interest. I think that would be all, and I think I'd be happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Sangeeta. I think it's really encouraging to see this interest in archiving amongst young people. But I think you also brought up some really interesting and important points, I think, especially since, well, most of us, but definitely students, a lot of their experiences and their lives are kind of chronicled on social media. And I think one, it's obviously a living archive of, what is out there, and and people's experiences, but it's also ephemeral. So once the day is over, that piece of information disappears, and there is no real kind of proactive archiving of social media, largely for the reasons that Tarunima was mentioning. It's also like, how much do you archive, what can you archive, and also these are people's archives, and so what kind of what level of access should one have to those archives, right? Like, there are questions of privacy, there are questions of also, and this came up again in the morning session, that consent is not perpetual. So also the idea that just because somebody has put something up on social media today doesn't mean that they want that in an archive tomorrow. And I think particularly for this generation who's constantly kind of chronicling their lives on social media, I think that's a really kind of, it's a difficult proposition, because they don't know what is being kept as well by large technological corporations as well, right? So there's a tension there between using the internet as a space for archiving or a space for chronicling, but also how lasting is that, and how proactive do we really have to be in order to kind of record and sustain that. Right. So we would, I think everybody would be happy to answer questions. So so please do answer, like, just kind of ask your question or raise your hand. You can ask your question in the chat window, or just raise your hand and we will unmute you. If we can just have all the speakers just on video, that would be great. So Venkat, do you want to just go ahead and ask the question?
I can try, but I have a bad connection. So, effectively, I'm just trying to figure out if the speakers could share a little bit more thought around the selection process. When I look at most material that enters the archives, at least the traditional archive, and I've discussed this with a couple of the speakers, is material that has gone, has benefited from time. Effectively, there's a process of curation by the creator of the material. And when one works on projects where we're not even sure who the creator of the material is, I'm just curious to know how this plays out over time. Are there any examples that anyone might have gone through to help archivists in particular to understand how to archive the present. Feeling a little sort of lost here. So it's fascinating. I'm just wondering how to address this.
I can tell you what we've been trying to do. I don't think it's by any means a fully resolved. I mean, I don't think it'll be a resolved or a settled answer for like a year or ever. I don't know if it'll ever be a settled answer. But so one of the things we did was we basically manually went through 1,000+ social media posts from share chat that were shared in Hindi. Around, I think, a 3-week cycle around the coronavirus. And so, I mean, it's something we're still, discussing, which is that if you don't precisely know how a particular piece of message can become relevant, it is important to get perspectives of a lot of people other than just a few people working on the project to sort of tell us what is important. Now, one of the things we realized, for example, was that, we said that we wanted to archive things that were potentially misinformation. And one thing we could have absolutely overlooked is information or news that we know is true. So we know that some mainstream article has shared an image or a video, which is known to be, which everyone sort of agrees on is accurate. And it's, we might have decided that that's not worth archiving because that's not misinformation in the present. But what one journalist informed us was that even if it's not misinformation in the present, it will get used 6 months down the line with a very different context. And so therefore it could be misinformation in the future. And so I think one of the things, at least what we're saying, one thing is we know that we need to get more perspectives, especially if we're thinking of it as an open archive or something that's sort of, not really targeted to any specific discipline. We definitely need to get more people to tell us, just tell us what could be relevant. But also from our exercise of going through some 1,000 posts, there were some pieces that were very clear for us that because they were anonymous but were reflecting a real world event, were very important to archive. So you have a lot of footage of, let's say, just like random footage of a highway where there are trucks moving. And it could have been from COVID, it could not have been from COVID, but it was shared in a particular instance, perhaps to try and imply that, this is what is happening because of a lockdown. So, that's I think one of those things big, and 3 of us were going through all this content, and this was, we all sort of went over, and there was a redundancy in some of the content that we were going through. And so that was the one category where we all agree that, okay, this is something that should be archived for sure. Then there were, and similarly, there were things we knew that we definitely did not want to archive. But then there is a huge gray zone in between that, we're still very lost about.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Otherwise, we can go to the next question. I think there's a question specifically for Rahul, which is that, do you see in the data visualization at neighborhood level that there's not enough infrastructure to support care?
Well, no, yes and no. I think, our initial idea was to try to understand that should there be a rise in cases in at least, this particular city, is there enough infrastructure to at least house them in terms of quarantine facilities, potential quarantine facilities? So far, I think the number of cases here has been such that it hasn't needed to be activated beyond a particular in zones itself. There itself, I think there is enough space as such. The problem lies in essentially, the facilities there, and whether you can ask people from, let's say, low-income housing to move to that quarantine facility when that is not offering them, minimal or basic sort of amenities. So I think it's a little bit of a gap in the implementation itself. But in terms of physical infrastructure, with the number of cases that we're seeing here so far, doesn't seem to be that problematic as of now.
Okay, thank you. So there's been a question about quality control, so to speak, and I think Tarunima has been addressing this to a great extent. That what do you keep and what do you not keep? But I think there's also an extra kind of layer to this question that what obviously kind of what the archivist chooses to keep is one kind of aspect of this, but also when it is proactive. So Sangeeta, I think in your project, for example, people are contributing their own, kind of proactively contributing content, right? And so in order for it to be archived. And I think I have a question that actually maybe, can be answered by anyone on the panel, which is around kind of crowdsourcing those decisions in and of itself. So how, does it make sense to open up the archive to kind of say, do you think, is there a sliding scale of what is important, what is of quality, etc., and how does one make those calls?
I can reply to that, because that's a conversation we've had in the past. The whole I think it's very much a case by case decision to make. I don't think it can be generalized, in the sense that obviously it's the notion of an open archive is ideal, and the fact that can be accessible is also ideal, and the sharing of resources is ideal. But then there are contingencies that have to be taken into account. For example, the specific work that we are doing now does not allow an unrestricted openness because of the sensitivity of the situation. And because of the risk of redundancy, of ideological entries, of trying and instrumentalize the construction of evidence to prove a point. So I think in this particular case, I think the decision has to be made very clearly at the beginning, and it's not like closing because we don't want to share, but it's creating a body of evidence that is solid and reliable, that then can be safely shared, but then cannot be indiscriminately open because of the nature of the material and the safety of the researchers. So I think those cases are very, I suppose, specific, but point to a direction that there is not a single answer to such a question. And so whenever you have an indiscriminate advocate for openness, I suppose there's the need to understand whether it's a fancy ideological claim, because obviously it's much cooler to have an open archive, but then is it realistic? Is it feasible? Is it safe? So I think that's where the discussion becomes more complicated and brings on a number of ethical questions that are the ones that inform the decisions.
Just would like to add.
Yes, please.
So, in terms of, the oral history interviews we're conducting in the, with students in the cure community spectrum. So there's this issue of privacy. And so, we're trying to ensure that you get consent. And so that's the same kind of problem that we face when you are trying to collect social media posts. Even the posts that are made in Facebook is public, So, the question of whether, you get consent for it, or is it in the public domain and you add it into the archive. So that's the thought process that that's sort of like a challenge that also we kind of went through again and again as we receive materials.
Yes, that's both of those are very important points. And I think, Francesca, as you were speaking, I was kind of thinking about like the tension between, say, a journalistic / reportage approach and an archivist approach, and kind of where do those intersect, right? Like the questions that you start kind of at the outset of a project. What is the philosophy of collecting this, as evidence? And we in fact had a panel on evidence and truth, which Nandini spoke of, chronicling the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and I think what's interesting is that the archive itself often is enough to speak the ideology, right? You don't have to explicitly kind of guide it. Just kind of reportage is often rich enough to kind of present that kind of evidence. There's another question for Rahul. And this is from Amil Varghese, and he's asking that there was no mention of indigenous knowledge systems or practices in your talk. Don't you think it is necessary to incorporate such knowledge systems and practices in discourses around climate change and conservation?
Yes, Anil, I fully agree, and I think it should be there. So we are hoping to add a new sort of section on our database, which is on climate voices, and climate stories. And those are things that we would obviously like to, incorporate from as many parts of the world, from indigenous, systems and practices as well. I think the key for us is to build it into a way in which it can be used in a classroom, either by an educator or by a self-learner. So at this point in time, we are exploring all of these options. The point is, we need access to these indigenous knowledge system practices, which potentially, if they are digital, we could, and are open access, then we can potentially include it into a learning resource or a teaching resource, and then basically have it disseminated widely. But I'm absolutely with you. I think the best way for teaching and learning actually comes through also storytelling. There are different ways in which we can incorporate this. We are looking at, building this particular feature on the website. But again, we need to find the source where we can get a lot of this information to begin with.
Yes, I think there was actually quite a few panels this morning of communities whose stories have been told, which actually might create an interesting repository for the work that you're doing. So hopefully everyone can benefit from that. Are there any more questions? No, okay, all right. So so we were going to wrap up at 7:15, so the timing isn't too bad. So thank you so much to our panelists for talking to us about the challenges and I guess also the kind of pleasures of archiving the now. And I hope that we've managed to answer some questions, because I think that it's very fraught given the the nature with which we have to act fast, as well as with safety and with concerns to people's security. And so, yes, so this conversation will be ongoing. Tomorrow morning, we have a conversation on standards and annotation tools, and that starts at 10:30 as usual with the other panels. So yes, so please join us for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.